Act 436, a law championed by Governor Rick Snyder. The state can take over financially struggling cities by handing complete authority to an appointed emergency manager. Emergency managers can break collective bargaining agreements, create new ordinances, abolish existing laws, sell off assets, and take away health care benefits from retirees. There's only one thing the law prohibits them from doing.
It's interesting to note in Public Act 436, the emergency manager cannot void a contract with bondholders. That's off limits. Bondholders are sacred. They cannot be touched. People are not sacred.
Nearly every city and school district that has had its democracy suspended under emergency management is a community like Flint, majority African American and saddled with high poverty rates. What these communities also have in common is that severe cuts in state funding have helped push them into financial distress. Emergency managers completely usurp the authority of locally elected officials.
How is this democracy?
Well, as much as we have for now.
Basically, the mayor has no power, authority. The city council has no power or authority, who were elected by the people. There's something wrong with that. And all of us need checks and balances because none of us make the best decision all the time.
We knew that this law was undemocratic. We knew it was dictatorial. We knew it was unprecedented. But we never dreamed that we would be faced with not being able to use our municipal water.
While Flint was under state control, the city's long-term water source was switched from Detroit's regional system to the newly created Karagandhi Water Authority. While the pipeline was under construction, the state forced the people of Flint to use the highly corrosive Flint River as the source of their drinking water. It was a cost-cutting move designed to save no more than $5 million.
When we heard it on the news that we might be drinking Flint water, might be going to that, we all thought it was a joke because everybody knows how gross the Flint River is.
Here's the Flint.
Here's the Flint. Here it is.
Average resident won't notice any difference.
But there was a drastic difference. Almost immediately, people began to complain about water that looked bad, smelled bad, and tasted bad.
And it's just been one debacle after another. We've had 3 or 4 boil water advisories.
My family broke out in a rash that we were told looks like scabies, but it wasn't scabies.
The rashes, the hair loss, the muscle stiffness, the soreness.
For instance, right now, we don't baptize. If we baptize, we have to go outside of the city of Flint.
It's almost like we're living in a nightmare.
While Flint residents were forced to continue to drink the river water, General Motors was allowed to switch back to the Detroit system because the highly corrosive Flint River was causing engine parts to rust. While many of the problems with the river water quickly became apparent to residents, other dangers remained hidden. For 9 months, they were subjected to high levels of TTHMs, a carcinogenic byproduct of chlorine. The state kept that information secret until January 2015. After that information was finally disclosed in a letter to residents, officials met with an angry public in an attempt to assure them that everything was under control.
If there is disruption, the police are prepared to remove the disruption, and then we will go on with the meetings.
This letter spoke about cancer, it spoke about nervous problems and people with weak immune systems. You spoke about that, doctor. And I think people feel that their bodies and their lives and their well-being is being compromised. So please,
So the study of water and disease has been going on since early Egyptian times. We have evidence of studies that
The TTHMs weren't the only concern. Flint residents were also at the meeting to express outrage over being forced to use water so foul you wouldn't give it to an animal.
I'm a tester. What do? I test water. I do health. Wholesome water is important. And you don't want to drink water that doesn't taste good, that doesn't smell good, and is cloudy. And so I understand that.
One of the people at that meeting was Leanne Walters, a mother of 4. That meeting is where she met Jerry Ambrose, the 4th emergency manager who was appointed by the governor to run Flint.
My water's been brown since the switch. My first encounter with the emergency manager, he called me a liar and called me stupid. I went up to him with bottles from my tap, and I'm like, well, this is my water. He's like, no, it's not. He's like, I don't believe that's your water.
In late February, after Leanne Walters had demanded that the city test her water, the results showed the water Walters' family was using had lead levels 7 times higher than the federal action level. Walters shared that startling information with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which reacted with alarm. In an email to the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, an EPA official wrote, "Wow, did he find the lead? She has 2 children under the age of 3. Big worries here." Those high levels prompted EPA water expert Miguel Del Toro to ask what kind of corrosion control the city was using. Flint must have optimal corrosion control treatment. Is it phosphates? The MDEQ responded to the EPA by saying it had an optimized corrosion control program in place, but offered no specific details. By March, residents were increasingly calling for a return to the Detroit system. After all, it had been providing Flint with clean, safe water for more than 50 years.
Our goal is to return Flint to the purest water source, and that is the Detroit source. In the interim, we want an injunction for that. We're not worried about long range right now. That still has to come to fruition, but immediately we want to go back to Detroit.
So, in answer to the second question, Detroit water, can we hook up again to the Detroit water? Great question. Everybody's asking, can we hook up? We can if we have a money tree. We don't have a money tree, and you guys would be sorry. So you'd be sorry if we hooked up on that, so that's the answer to that question.
Do you live in Flint?
The emergency manager on through to the treasurer's office and on to Lansing, the governor's mansion, have shown a total disregard for the human needs of the people.
As public anger grew, what would become a persistent lie took root.
It was Detroit that sent us a letter that said, we're canceling your contract. Go find your water someplace else. All right? Now, we looked at that, and we said,
I'm not sure that's true.
well, we have the Flint River.
Throughout the crisis, city and state officials repeatedly claimed they were forced to use the Flint River after Detroit canceled a long-term contract. What those same officials didn't say was that Detroit had tried to enter into a new agreement. Darnell Early, the city's 3rd emergency manager, flatly rejected this offer just before the switch.
We chose to use the Flint River.
It's working, Jerry. Look at that ball
It would make sense.
Look at that work, Jerry.
Sir.
That's
Excuse me.
Sir. You're killing us. Sir, please.
I'm not killing anybody.
Faced with public outrage, the Flint City Council voted to return to the Detroit water system.
Let us go back to Detroit, give the people good quality, clean drinking water until this KWA come.
Emergency manager Jerry Ambrose overruled that vote.
The city council voted and followed and did what the people asked. The next day, he put out a press release saying this is incomprehensible.
Emergency manager Ambrose insisted the change back to the Detroit system was unnecessary because Flint's water was perfectly fine.
The narrative that they're using to get us to sit down and be comfortable with this situation is that the water is safe.
But the water was not safe.
In April, beginning of April, we found out my child had lead poisoning.
Lead is a powerful neurotoxin. Childhood exposure to lead results in IQ loss, behavioral problems, and learning disability, all of which can push young kids into the school-to-prison pipeline. For children and adults alike, lead can cause extensive harm to almost every organ or system in the body, especially the central nervous system. Perhaps most disturbing of all is that the impact of lead exposure can be passed from one generation to the next.
I'm terrified of what, the outcome of this, the aftermath of this could be neurologically for my children.
Remember that claim from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality that corrosion control was in place? Leanne Walters found out on her own from a water plant employee that in fact, no corrosion control was being used.
On Detroit water, we were using a corrosive control, phosphate. The city is not using that control. Pipes are eating themselves from the inside out, and everything that's built up into them is now coming through our homes because these things are not in place.
She shared that information with the EPA's Del Toro, who was able to verify it. In an April 2015 email, Del Toro wrote, Pat Cook has confirmed that following the disconnection from Detroit, Flint has not been operating any corrosion control treatment, which is very concerning given the amount of lead service lines in the city. The state had made a catastrophic decision to not treat the corrosive river water with a mandatory corrosion control. People's water was discolored because it was leaching rust from the city's old iron infrastructure. What was not visible were lead particles being leached from lead service lines and lead plumbing.
I keep hearing the phrase, and I agree with it, we feel like we live in a third world country. We're getting poisoned water, and we have no rights.
We want clean water! No!
We're told that it's just happening to her. It's just happening to one person in her area. It's not true.
I've reached out to the health department with no answers.
Stop poisoning our children! Stop poisoning our children!
I've reached out to City Hall, Ambrose.
People with discolored water are at a greater risk for having lead or copper in your water. Everybody needs to get it tested, but especially anybody with discolored water.
I've written to Governor Snyder. I've called his office with no results.
You are literally in a fight for your life right now.
Some of us voted on the council. We say we want good water yesterday. Turn the faucet, cut Detroit on until they get the river water fixed.
The powers that be may not be listening to us. I believe that if we keep on talking, and if we keep on screaming, and if we keep on shouting, sooner or later something's going to happen.
We need the federal government in here.
In May 2015, Governor Rick Snyder declared Flint's financial emergency to be over. The city's fourth emergency manager vacated his position with one final order. He forbade Flint's elected officials from overturning any previous EM orders, including the switch to the river, for at least 1 year.
And when you get to the point where you feel like it don't matter what I say or do, they're gonna do what they want to do anyway, that's a sad day for America. Since the emergency managers to come through here, we have nothing but debt.
Distrustful of the city and the state, Leanne Walters, with the help of the EPA's Del Toro, connected with Virginia Tech professor Mark Edwards. Edwards helped Walters and Del Toro conduct a full analysis of the water flowing into her home.
They were the worst results we've seen in 25 years. So bad, at first we didn't believe it. The levels got as high as 13,500 parts per billion, which is about 10,000 times higher than recommended levels, the maximum levels. 2.5 times hazardous waste levels of lead. It's not even corrosion 101 to realize that water is going to cause this problem. If anyone had looked at this who was reasonably competent for 5 minutes, they would have predicted that this would have occurred.
Our water! Whose water is it? Our water! Whose water is it? Our water!
All right. By the middle of June, the city was wrapping up federally mandated drinking water sampling. Flint was very much in danger of exceeding federal safe water standards. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, which analyzes those samples, began warning Flint officials that its water supply was in danger of violating lead and copper standards. State MDEQ officials wrote, "We hope you have 61 more lead copper samples collected and sent to the lab, and that they will be below the action level for lead. As of now, with 39 results, Flint is over the action level for lead. If any more high lead samples were collected, the city would be out of compliance, forcing it to start spending millions of dollars to replace lead service lines throughout Flint." Given that warning, the city focused on testing homes it knew would produce low lead results. Consequently, all of the remaining homes sampled came in below the action level for lead. Also in June, based on test results from Leanne Walters' home, the EPA's Del Toro wrote an internal memo sounding the alarm about lead in Flint's water, warning that it should be a major concern from a public health standpoint. Feeling a sense of urgency to make the issue public, Del Toro broke EPA protocol by giving a copy of the memo to Walters. She shared it with the ACLU of Michigan, which published the memo in early July. In response, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality completely denied there was any problem with lead in Flint's drinking water, even though all the warning signs were clear and evidence of contamination was mounting.
Anyone who is concerned about lead in the drinking water in Flint can relax. There is no broad problem right now that we've seen with lead in the drinking water in Flint.
But the person who sounded the warning, the EPA's Del Toro, was no longer available for comment.
MDEQ told Ms. Walters that Mr. Del Toro had been handled and that he would no longer be able to work on the Flint water situation. So when I heard that, I grew quite concerned because scientifically, there wasn't just smoke here, there was fire here.
In early July, Flint residents and clean water activists from across the state tried to take their concerns directly to the governor.
I mean, what did you get?
We sent a registered letter asking for the governor to come to Flint. We have people from all over the state of Michigan here. We're representing several cities. And we got a terse response 2 weeks later, simply saying the governor's busy and cannot meet with you. So we're going to be persistent until we do have a meeting. And it would be very good to, talk to the person who handles the governor's calendar.
Okay, because to file and do what we're supposed to have a request. That was denied. You've come in. I've come out and tried to speak to you people, and excuse me, you people. So with that being said, I am more than happy to accept what you would like to give to the governor, and I'll be more than happy to pass.
Wanting clean water should not make me an activist.
Right. But it's going to cost $12 million to go back to Detroit. I said, you know what? I said, yeah, it might cost $12 million to go back to Detroit. But I'm going to tell you what, after this is all said and done, it's going to cost them way more than $12 million.
You can't filter lead out of your body. You can't filter copper. This is the legacy we have to leave to our children.
Seeing my family go through this and feeling just so helpless angers me so badly. And seeing my little brother, seeing my mom go through way worse, just makes me just despise the government completely.
In the face of official denials, the question became how to get to the truth. The answer was to conduct an independent, scientifically rigorous, and citizen-led study of Flint's water. Mark Edwards applied for an emergency grant from the National Science Foundation. Test kits were sent to Flint in August. On the ground in Flint were the ACLU of Michigan and Flint's Coalition for Clean Water, a diverse grassroots group of organizations that had come together in the spring of 2015. Operating from the basement of the Saints of God Church, they began the work of distributing and collecting water samples from 300 homes.
This week we're going to get these kits out to the community and they can test and we'll know for sure what's in our water.
Citizens ensured the most scientifically valid and geographically broad sampling was conducted.
Scientifically, we couldn't have done it any better ourselves. They implemented training procedures that I think the city and EPA should be using around the country.
So after 45 seconds, you're going to fill up the medium-sized bottle, and then when that's full, you're going to take the bottle out and then wait for 2 minutes with the water still flowing.
They also implemented procedures to prevent tampering with the samples because they knew that might be raised as a possible concern. And they were right.
We want to have zero reason for anyone to question what we've done here.
What we did when we picked up samples from people, we had them initial near the seam, and then we taped up everything in front of them so the initials are under the tape so that the resident would know that their sample hasn't been touched by anybody but them, and Virginia Tech also knows that.
I thought no one would claim people would put lead in the water samples to fake that there was high lead in water, but people from the state said that to me.
In addition to supplying and analyzing test kits for the citizen-led study, Edwards also loaded up a minivan with students and drove to Flint for 2 days of additional on-site testing. As Edwards conducted tests at various homes, new concerns were raised.
So that's chlorine. So there's just none in the water here.
Drink it.
So there's no disinfectant.
We tried was
questioning the Legionnaire's disease. Is that a possibility with the water? Is it only in...
Legionnaire's disease can sometimes come from water. People do sometimes get it in their showers.
I mean, we have to bathe in it. We do cook with it. We have this one here who gets sores all over his body. He's on antibiotic and antibiotic ointment right now. They all have just gone through pneumonia in the middle of summer, which, according to the hospital, is extremely rare.
I haven't sampled at a house that has any chlorine yet.
5 months later, the state disclosed for the first time that the number of Legionnaire's cases in and around Flint began spiking dramatically in the months after the switch to the river. Since June 2014, 87 people have contracted the rare pneumonia-like disease. 10 have died. As soon as the first sample kits began arriving back at Virginia Tech, their analysis showed alarming levels of lead.
And what we're testing to see is how much lead is actually getting into the water over time. So as you can see, for the Flint water, there's a lot of white particles inside, and that's showing you that there's lead in it, whereas compared to the Detroit water, it's much clearer than the Flint water.
Feeling morally compelled to immediately address an apparent public health crisis, Edwards and his team began contacting residents with results and posting information on a newly created website. As the results were revealed, the state continued to publicly claim that the water was safe. For example, Brad Werfel told Michigan Radio, "The samples don't match the testing that we've been doing in the same kind of neighborhoods all over the city for the past year." But at the same time, the governor's office secretly arranged for an unnamed donor to purchase 1,500 water filters that were handed out to Flint families on September 1st.
I thought we didn't have a water problem in Flint. Not true. These people suggest something else. Not true. It is definitely not true. People want clean, safe water. As a matter of fact, people deserve clean, safe water.
In a city with a majority African American population, a poverty rate of 40%, and average water bills of $150 a month, people had few options.
They can't afford the extra expense of buying a filter and making that initial investment. For someone who's living check to check on a limited fixed income, I mean, that can be astronomical.
Like we keep wanting to have, trust, but, it's constantly being destroyed. Your trust in the system is constantly being destroyed because it's like you don't even count.
As Virginia Tech continued to analyze samples and post results, state officials responded by attacking the credibility of Edwards and his team. In an email to a Flint Journal reporter, the MDEQ's Brad Werfel claimed this group specializes in looking for high lead problems. They pull that rabbit out of that hat everywhere they go. They've just arrived in town, fanning political flames irresponsibly. Residents of Flint concerned about the health of their community don't need more of that. On September 15th, members of the Coalition for Clean Water, which led the effort to collect sample kits throughout the city, held a press conference to discuss Virginia Tech's analysis of water from 277 Flint homes, 4 times as many homes tested by the city and state in the previous 6 months.
We estimate that the water in about 5,000 Flint homes is over standards set by the World Health Organization for lead in water because the water is too corrosive. It has too much salt in it, and there was no plan to control the corrosion. Flint is the only city in America that I'm aware of who does not have a corrosion control plan in place.
Shortly after Edwards raised that issue at the press conference, Howard Croft, then Flint's director of public works, encountered a citizen visibly upset by the corrosion control issue.
Why did you think that was important in the first place, about corrosion? Why did you think that was important in the first place? I am angry that I am doing this stuff and drinking this water and doing this stuff, and I could die before my time. Why didn't y'all think about that? Answer that point blank question.
I think I will be the one asking the DEQ that.
I will be the one asking why did you believe with the engineering team there? Because that's we followed their guidance.
The MDEQ did nothing to ensure that treatment was properly planned, approved, or started when the switch took place. Because of this negligent act, there is a serious lead problem in the water in the city of Flint. We are in a public health crisis.
The emergency managers appointed by Governor Rick Snyder made the decision to switch from clean Detroit water to the Flint River. And that's what's causing these problems, as Professor Edwards and his team at Virginia Tech have discovered. The question is, given what they found, how were the city and state able to claim that Flint water is actually safe and complies with federal drinking water standards?
Yeah.
With the assistance of everybody here, what we found is that the city and state did a number of things that skewed the results. One of the things the city did was to test homes it knew would produce low lead results. For example, they went to an area on Flushing Road that had new infrastructure. Under federal law, the city is required to identify and test the water of homes known to be at high risk of lead contamination. At least half of the homes tested need lead service lines, and at least half of the homes tested need lead plumbing. The city failed in its obligation to verify that all the homes being tested were high-risk homes. So how were you able to determine that every one of those homes had a lead service line?
You know, so we try to go through our records.
Why was I not provided with those records when I filed a Freedom of Information Act request?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for you right now, to be honest with you. Sometimes records get lost, so
right.
we just
so you
know
don't necessarily have all the records?
that could be a possibility.
So how were you, again, how were you able to determine that every single house had a lead service line?
We're not really. We throw bottles out everywhere just to collect as many as we can to try to hit our number. Yeah, we're still looking for the records.
Even though it's after the fact? The reports have already been submitted.
Oh yeah, the reports
and the compliance was based on those reports.
That's how they base their compliance, yes.
Okay, thank you.
On the same day that city officials admitted that they had improperly conducted their water tests, the ACLU of Michigan also debunked a persistent lie.
It was Detroit that sent us a letter that said, we're canceling your contract. Go find your water someplace else. All right? Now
On the day of the press conference, Flint Public Works Director Howard Croft started to repeat the lie.
There was a termination made by DWSD.
Right. I have a letter from Darnell Early saying they had the option to enter into a new agreement, and they chose not to enter into that new agreement.
There were...
Correct? Is that correct?
I think there were negotiations on what it would look like, and I think those negotiations were not anything that would have benefited the city.
So the city chose not to stay with Detroit?
Well, again, once the contract was terminated, I think evaluations have gone on all the way up to the state level on what would the best course of action would be for the city of Flint, and that was the determination.
All the way to the governor's office?
All the way to the governor's office.
Croft's assertion was the first time the governor's office was implicated in the decision to switch to the Flint River. After Virginia Tech released its results, state officials continued to claim that the water was safe overall, but they began to talk about the issue of aging infrastructure. For example, on September 21st, the MDEQ's Brad Werfel told MLive, Flint's water supply presently meets all state and federal water quality standards, but added that homes with lead service connections and lead plumbing always have been imparting some part per billion of lead, which is a concern. Focusing attention on infrastructure was a way to avoid addressing the root of the crisis, which was the state's fateful decision to switch to the Flint River, and its subsequent move to not use corrosion control, a $100 per day expense. But those supposed savings led to unimaginable costs. On September 24th, a pediatrician from Flint's Hurley Medical Center, Dr. Hannah Atisha, released a study of thousands of health records. The study showed there was a direct link between the switch to the Flint River and the elevated blood lead levels of Flint children.
We looked at all children under the age of 5 years. We looked at their lead levels pre-switch, and then we looked at blood lead levels post-switch. For children 5 years and below, the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels in Flint was 2.1%. And then post-switch, the percentage was 4, so a doubling, and that was statistically significant.
Confronted with that evidence, the state launched yet another attack. A spokeswoman for Governor Rick Snyder wrote in an email that the Hurley data had been spliced and diced. The Michigan Department of Health and Human Services also jumped in, saying the state's data was not in line with Dr. Hannah Atisha's results. Those attempts to discredit Dr. Hannah Atisha's work quickly fell apart. The Detroit Free Press compared the state's data with Dr. Hannah Atisha's results and found that the state's own data showed that there was a higher percentage of kids in Flint with elevated lead levels in their blood after the switch. In fact, according to records obtained by Virginia Tech's Professor Edwards, the State Department of Health and Human Services had detected a significant spike in the lead blood levels of Flint children in the months immediately following the changeover.
Lead-free water now! Lead-free water now! Lead-free water now! Lead-free water!
State legislators and a U.S. congressman representing Flint began to turn up the political heat on the Snyder administration. Finally forced to take some action, the state held a press conference, one that Flint residents weren't allowed to attend. There, state officials announced the creation of a 10-point plan, which included free filter distribution and expanding testing of water at public schools. But the plan didn't include switching back to Detroit, something state officials still insisted was unnecessary.
There's some misunderstanding that the water coming out of the Flint system has lead in it. Know this, every time we've tested the water, since it switched over to Flint River, it was non-detect for lead. So our issue is lead service lines.
What good does it to tell people this is your plumbing's fault? That seems to be what MDQ is priding itself on. Is they're getting water that has low lead up to the property line. Every city in the country does that. Okay, that's not a problem. The problem is what happens when that corrosive water sits in those lead-bearing plumbing materials and it takes up more lead than is allowed by federal law.
EPA warnings weren't enough. The Virginia Tech study wasn't enough. The Hurley study wasn't enough. State officials continued to deny the river's role in Flint's lead crisis.
Now, from my standpoint as director of the DEQ and our responsibility, whether the water comes from Detroit or whether the water comes from the Flint River, we still have the same issue.
Wrong. On October 7th, a panel of experts formed earlier in the year by Flint's former mayor and a previous emergency manager held just its third meeting. In a small conference room crowded with media, the experts recommended that Flint switch back to the Detroit system in order to protect its residents from further harm. On October 8th, 6 months after Leanne Walters learned that her child had lead poisoning, 8 months after the EPA began raising concerns, and 16 months after the river water began causing massive infrastructure damage and irreparable physical harm to residents, Governor Rick Snyder finally announced that he would allow Flint to return to the Detroit system. The governor also insisted that there was no reason to assign blame to the completely avoidable man-made disaster.
Again, this isn't about blaming anyone. Right now, I want to stay focused in on the solutions and taking action to solve the problems.
There is blame. We are under emergency management.
After the press conference, Snyder spokesperson Sarah Werfel provided a rambling response to a direct question. Was the governor's office involved in the decision to use the river in the first place?
Can you guys hang on a second?
Just one more question. Howard Croft, the director. One more question. Howard Croft, the director of Public Works for Flint, in a recent interview said the decision to switch to the Flint River came out of the governor's office.
I can't address that at all. In fact, because at the time, you go back to the history of this, of the community very much wanting to switch to a new water authority, making the switch, the Detroit Water and Sewer Department at the time back last spring saying, hey, we're going to cut you off. That's a lie. There were certain steps at the time that I can't speak to with all of that history, but I can't.
So so you're saying this decision did not emanate from the governor's office?
You're saying that the governor's office was directly involved. I can't address that at all. No,
Why
as far
not?
as I know, because that's not accurate.
Well, you're a spokesman for the governor, correct?
Yes, I am.
So
that's why I'm talking to you right now.
So
thank you for your
So that's
time.
a yes or no question.
Snyder wasn't the only official saying there was no need to place blame. Darnell Early, now the emergency manager over Detroit Public Schools, and the man who signed the letter rejecting Detroit's offer to keep selling water to Flint, echoed the governor's word.
But I don't want to focus on what happened back in 2013. I think it's important that we mobilize all resources that we can to fix the problem.
But all resources weren't being mobilized, prompting newly elected Flint Mayor Karen Weaver to declare a state of emergency.
I'm looking for help from the state, and we're looking for help from the federal government. I feel like we have no other option but to reach out and ask for help.
The Flint water crisis began to draw broad national and international media attention.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It sounds to me as like you're basically setting up a red flag, trying to make this a national issue.
Yes,
so
I
that you
am.
can get
And,
that
we've been
national help.
trying to get national attention for a while, so we don't want people to feel that because we've made the switch back to Detroit water that everything is fine now, because it's not.
On December 29th, a task force that Snyder had appointed in response to mounting pressure reported its initial findings from its investigation into the state's handling of the crisis. What is disturbing about the MDEQ's responses, the letter read, is their persistent tone of scorn and derision. In fact, the letter continued, the MDEQ seems to have been more determined to discredit the work of others who ultimately proved to be right than to pursue its own oversight responsibility. On the day that letter was issued, MDEQ Director Dan Wyant and his chief spokesperson, Brad Werfel, both resigned. Three weeks after Mayor Weaver's state of emergency declaration, Governor Rick Snyder issued his own on January 5, 2016, at last opening up the door to federal relief. By the time of the governor's State of the State address in January 2016, the people of Flint had been drinking water contaminated with lead for nearly 2 years. People in the city still couldn't drink the water.
Members of the Joint Convention, the Governor of the State of Michigan, Rick Snyder.
Tonight, I will address the crisis in Flint first and in depth. Let me walk you through the facts. Tonight I'm releasing a comprehensive timeline of the steps we've taken and the actions underway to solve this crisis. First, this crisis began in the spring of 2013 when the Flint City Council voted 7-1 to buy water from the Karagandhi Water Authority, the KWA.
That vote had nothing to do with the decision to use the Flint River as the temporary water source for a city of 100,000 people.
Detroit Water and Sewer Department provided notice of termination effective 1 year later, and on April 25, 2014, Flint began to use water from the Flint River as an interim source.
What the governor leaves out is the fact that Detroit wanted to keep selling clean, safe water to Flint. The governor's comprehensive timeline also omits the fact that when the Flint City Council voted to return to the Detroit system in March 2015, Snyder's emergency manager overruled that vote, forcing the people of Flint to continue using poisonous water.
On September 28, 2015, I was first briefed on the potential scope and magnitude of the crisis.
Now these corrupt cover-ups, hiding the facts. Had the mayor drink a cup and tell us all to relax. Then put that on the news, cause it's legal to lie to the public and the media.
I've written to Governor Snyder. I've called his office with no results. I've written
a registered letter asking for the governor to come to Flint. Talk to the person who handles the governor's calendar.
Somebody get the nuts. I bought you some water. Let's go. Go get him. Man, you don't even live in Flint. Somebody get the nuts. I want to give him drink that shit. We ain't feeding our kids. We ain't letting our kids drink. Drink that shit. 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 Drink that shit.
We'll take a step back.
What's the credentials?
The credentials is you're invited by a representative. Take a step back.
Representative.
Who representative who?
Representative who? We represent Flint.
No, I'm talking about your representative, sir. Okay.
Our representative?
Okay, you can stand out here and I'll talk to your elected representative, but this is a credentialed event. It's not open to the public.
You deserve to know the truth, and I have a responsibility to tell the truth.
Governor Snyder has not yet testified under oath, but on February 3rd, 2016, Leanne Walters didn't hesitate to raise her hand and swear to tell the truth.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative.
In 2014, in a city with no democracy, forced under an emergency manager, handpicked by Governor Snyder, a decision was made to switch the water source without the proper testing and enforcement of regulation. The citizens in Flint were assured for 18 months that the water was safe. We fought the city and the state, saying there was something wrong, and we were dismissed. We conducted citizen-based samplings. We educated and distributed 300 samples equally throughout the city. We collected back 277 samples. All of this was done in a 3-week turnaround. There are people in Flint today still not being assisted during this crisis. Illegal immigrants, disabled, and shut-ins. Broken policy and procedures are smothering the outcry of an entire community suffering financially, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I urge you to help restore some of the trust lost by never allowing this to happen again.
And stay tuned. This story is not over. They poisoned the wrong city.
Honestly, I'm questioning if this was intended. What made you go and change the water source that Flint